Okay, we have the brave folks who came across campus, they parked somewhere and found their way here for the ethics CLE, this tradition that is unique to Colorado law. My name is Georgette Vigil. I'm the Senior Director for Alumni Engagement and Donor Relations at your alma mater. How many alumni in the room? Yay! Glad you are all here. How many from the 70s? Yes, 80s and 90s? 2000s, yeah, representing 2010s. Okay, okay. Well, we are very pleased that you are here. I also want to recognize any law alumni board members or past law alumni board members, if you'd raise your hand. Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn everything over to the panelists, and I'll turn it over to Kristin Bronson to introduce the panelists and get this ethics started. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgette. Hi, folks. I'm Kristin Bronson. I was class of 97, and I'm on the Law Alumni Board now. But I also am Executive Director of the Colorado Lawyers Committee, which is kind of why I'm here today. I am joined by colleagues and friends. I've got Melissa Hart, who is Colorado Supreme Court Justice, but also on our Access to Justice Commission for the state. And Toni-Anne Nuñez, who is the Access to Justice Director for the DBA and the CBA. So we've got a great panel for you today. We're going to just kind of have a conversation, we hope, about access to justice issues, the strength of our judicial system really relies on everyone having equal access to the court system. But there are so many barriers and remain so many barriers in our state. And the great news is that there are a lot of wonderful things happening in Colorado, a lot of innovations, a lot of ways in which we are trying to develop more resources to try to close the access to justice gap. And I'm hoping we can talk about a few of those today. A couple of years ago, some of you may have come to this ethics CLE when Dave Stark from Faegre Drinker Biddle Reith presented on closing the access to justice gap. I like to think of this as a bit of a supplement or a part two to Dave's presentation, if you were here for that. But as with all sequels, I'm sure this second version will pale in comparison because Dave really is the OG of access to justice. But we are going to do our best. So today I'm really hoping we can offer a variety of perspectives around the problem that we're facing in Colorado, because we have up here on the stage different perspectives represented. Toni-Anne is with the Bar Association, has been running amazing programs, huge variety of programs, huge impact. Melissa's with the courts and has been very engaged, probably the point person for the courts on access to justice issues. And then my organization, which is a legal advocacy nonprofit. So I'm looking forward to discussing some of these new innovations that we are seeing right now and the populations that we're hoping to serve. So let's kick things off. I think we probably ought to start by outlining the problem. So I know that the bar's been looking at this a lot. Toni-Anne, can you tell us how big is the gap?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. So I think people often think, well, there's a gap, but people are exaggerating about where that gap is. And so we do have these statistics up on the board here. Truly and really, the gap is huge. Nearly 1 in 4 people in Colorado live below 200% of the poverty line. I mean, think about that. The nearly 1 in 4 people that you meet on the street would qualify for legal aid. So that's a huge piece that, we really need to pay attention to. The other piece that we look at, and the other chart that I love here, is looking at the pro se rate in the courts. And Justice Hart will, I'm sure, talk a little bit about this. We're going to have kind of a back and forth about what the court does and what the court can do. But one thing we cannot deny is that the courts are overwhelmed. The judges are exhausted, and the attorneys that serve in those courts are frustrated because they feel like the courts take forever to get an order out, and in reality, they don't have the option to get them out any faster because of their caseload. And, we had, I spoke to a judge just about 2 weeks ago, and she was saying, she actually is on the domestic docket, and she said, I had 14 cases before me. I should have had 28 lawyers in 1 week. I had 2. And that meant that all of those other cases before her were people on their own trying to navigate the system. And that's not even, I can talk about language barriers as well, but, we then discuss things like, well, there is this navigating the system, which is difficult and complicated. Even some attorneys are having a hard time with navigating the system. And then you add things like language barriers. I always say the law is a language, and then we have the language barriers as well, just adding to that. So I want to talk a little bit about this statistic with respect to the rates. Pay attention to domestic relations, and you can see that 75%, 74 to 76, it varies, but sadly not a lot, percent of cases are filed pro se. That means 3/4 nearly, or more some years, filing on their own in a very complicated area of law where it affects every part of someone's life, their children, their finances, their home, their religion, their money. And then you look, people have said to me, oh, well, that only happens when they're filing. Once they file, they get a lawyer. Well, if that was true, then the responding rate would not be 73%. So it is true that these people are truly navigating the system to the best of their ability, and the courts are struggling to do that. And I want to also point out the civil county rates. And you'll see here that the rate for filing is 20%. The rate for responding is 97%. So why is that? Well, in county court, we're dealing with things like collections and landlord and tenant and bankruptcy issues. So what happens is the landlords or the people with deep pockets, they have attorneys when they're filing, but the people that are then responding to all these issues don't. And so that's why you're seeing that discrepancy in numbers.
But I think it's important to note, though, that lots of landlords have attorneys. 80% of the filers have attorneys, but a lot of cases, and I think we who live in the metro area forget about this. In the metro area, most landlords are filing with attorneys. But if you get out of the metro area, most landlord-tenant cases are unrepresented on both sides.
Yeah, these numbers are averages. It's very different.
Yeah,
county to
when you
county.
break it down by district, or in this case by county, when you break it down by county, which we have statistics of this broken down by county, when you go into the smaller counties in the more rural parts of the state, county cases are almost entirely unrepresented. So the county judges who often in the very rural districts are themselves not lawyers, are dealing with unrepresented parties. So you've got cases running in county court that are no lawyers in civil cases, trying to sort out these problems.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that there are 4 counties in the state that don't have any licensed attorneys practicing in.
That is correct.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit, I guess, about the causes or some of the barriers. What is going on here? Why do we have these gaps?
Well, and I want to talk too about that poverty line. So you'll hear people say all the time, well, there are resources out there. The courts will help people with their
pro se
parties, sorry.
Sure.
And the agencies like the Colorado Bar, the Denver Bar, Metro Volunteer Lawyers will help people. And of course, the big person in town, Colorado Legal Services, will help. And absolutely, all of those groups are helping people. But they're only helping people at 200% and below poverty. And also, I want to make a note, and I'll double back on this later on in our conversation. Colorado Legal Services, which truly is the big institution in Colorado because they have 13 offices across the state, they say that nearly 50% of people that come to them that qualify for legal aid, they turn away because they just don't have the capacity to deal with it. And so I want you to think about, who are we talking about? Who is this person? Yeah. Who is this poor person, this 1 in 4 that I'm seeing on the street? So the guidelines under the Colorado CJD 98.0 says the poverty guidelines for May of 2024, a family of 1 has to make $15,000. $15,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
Or less.
Or less.
Or less. And then they can qualify for a fee waiver or something like that. So they can get $30,000 is the cap for most of these legal aid programs. Between 150 and 200%, they will assist them. Anyone that makes more than that is sort of in the middle. And we can talk a little bit about that above the line, the issue that there are people who seriously could not afford. I can't tell you how many times I hear an attorney say to me, I couldn't afford me. Mm-hmm. And I think it's true. The other piece that I wanted to talk about was, all of this, and you can go ahead and move to the next one.
Well, I was going to mention too that Colorado Legal Aid doesn't do, they don't do the full panoply of legal issues, right? They handle a discrete types of cases, and immigration, for example, is not something that they work on. So even if you are able to qualify, it may not be the kind of case that they even are able to help you with.
Correct. So, these are some of the issues, and it affects really all of us. People say, well, why should I care? Well, because these have a ripple effects on our economy. So even if you don't think that you should care, maybe you should care because you're selfish. These are all the things that impact our economy. When low-income issues arise, a lot of these parties have no resources. We take for granted that if we get sick, we can go to the doctor, or if our child is ill or has to come home from school, that we can get daycare. And that's not true. For a lot of these people, they don't have a car, they don't have childcare, they don't have access to technology, and Justice Hart will do a great job, I'm sure, talking a little bit about the digital divide, because it is a huge issue in Colorado. They don't have a phone, or if they do, their numbers change all the time, and taking time off, if they have a job, is really difficult for them. So all of these issues just compound in every problem that they have, and when they have it, they don't have that structure and resource that we do normally in order to solve these problems.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the digital divide at all?
Sure. I think it's one of the things that we saw on the listening tour, so I don't know if we want to talk about the listening tour, or that's,
we're getting there. Yeah.
One of the next slides.
Yeah. Well, what I'll say is when we have the Colorado Lawyers Committee runs something called Denver Legal Night, and we do it on the first and third Wednesday of every month, and it's at Centro San Juan Diego in the Rhino neighborhood. And of course, you got to be able to drive in for that, and I am amazed at the lengths people will drive in to come to a legal clinic. It's pretty incredible, and they may or may not get seen that day. We try to see folks, but we sometimes have so many that we have to turn people away. Between the other thing we didn't mention on here too is language access, which is also very much part of the gap, and where you don't have the either language access or cultural competency with the court in some areas. I think that can be a really big challenge too.
And the courts, once you're in the court system, the courts will provide interpreters where they can, but even they're overwhelmed. We are having a real crisis of interpreters inside the courtroom as well.
Yeah.
And then I can tell you that we always look for translations. So if you are an attorney or not an attorney and would like to volunteer, you'll hear this often from me. There's lots of opportunity, and if you speak a second language, we really need you.
Yeah, yeah, that's really true. I'll say also, sometimes the gap is really huge on an issue because there's some emerging issue that has come up. So I'm going to give an example. This last fall, we all know there was a surge of immigrants coming in from the southern border, and we had thousands of people arriving with no real legal access to work. The shelters were overwhelmed, at least in Denver. We had people sleeping on the streets. A lot of them had really young children. And it was a pretty dire situation. And you saw the legal community come together between the city and the state and a lot of community partners. We had over 500 volunteers that participated in legal clinics and were able to get, at this point, over 3,500 people, either work authorization or temporary protective status. But those short-term emerging issues, when the state of Colorado was doing their unwind after Medicaid eligibility changed once the pandemic lifted, you had about 750,000 people in the state that lost their health care. And there were all kinds of mistakes being made. And there was a dearth of attorneys to work in this area. There's some incredible attorneys that do, but they're able to handle the regular volume, not these moments of, huge waves of cases. And so those are, I think, the moments where that collective impact and the collective work of the legal community is so important. But sometimes those gaps are short-term, and then sometimes you're dealing with more long-term issues like some of these we've been talking about. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the innovations that we are seeing that really are working. I was intent on keeping this very upbeat today, so we want to do that. We want to talk. I would like to discuss with you guys, how do we expand resources for legal information? How do we expand legal assistance while we still maintain our professional standards as lawyers? And a lot of times the bar is very sensitive to our turf, and having non-attorneys perhaps creep into the areas of law that we so preciously guard. And that can be a real debate. So I know, Melissa, that the Supreme Court has been working very hard in adapting the scope of the authorized practice of law to kind of address some of these access to justice needs.
Yes, we have been, and we and others state Supreme Courts are going to continue to be. One of the things that I think people have increasingly recognized is, although a lot of the pro bono opportunities that we've already talked about and that we're going to talk about more are really important, and there are things that you all can be doing and that other attorneys can be doing. The reality is we are not going to pro bono our way out of this problem. We couldn't. Even if every single person watching this and every single lawyer in Colorado was giving 50 hours of pro bono every year, which we all should be, there would still be unmet legal need. And so we have to be doing other things too. We should be doing that, but we need to be doing other things too. And so one of the things that Colorado has done just this year that we're really excited about, because we did it really well. I'm going to say, I'm going to pat us on the back, all of us. I'm patting us all on the back. Is we graduated our first class and licensed our first class of licensed legal paraprofessionals. We are not the first state to do it, but I think people around the country are recognizing that we are the state that rolled it out best. And now other states are looking to us as a model. It took us a long time, and that's part of why it seems to be working. A lot of states tried to just said, okay, this is what we're gonna do. It took us 4 years to roll out the program once we said we were gonna do it. And part of why we did it well is because we didn't go first. We waited for a few other states to do it. Washington State was the first. Their program was a pretty epic fail. And in fact, they've ended it. So the people who are licensed there can still do the work that they're doing, but they've stopped licensing any other folks. And the reasons it was a fail is it was designed to fail, honestly. It was designed with a really excessive amount of educational requirement, a really excessive amount of work requirement, so that by the time you became what they called licensed, I can't even remember it.
Paraprofessionals?
No, triple LTs. Licensed legal, limited licensed legal technicians was what they called them, which already, everything that's wrong with it is right there in the name. By the time you became what they called triple LTs, you had spent so much money on education, and you had spent so much time completing the 3,000-hour work requirement before you could get a license that very few people wanted to do it. And the education had to be through the law schools in the state, and the law schools couldn't figure out, and it was a 2-year program you had to do, the law schools couldn't figure out how to make a value proposition out of offering the class because only a few people in any given year wanted to do it. So we learned a lot from that though, right? We looked at that and said, okay, that model doesn't make sense. You're making such high barriers, that doesn't make sense. What are we trying to achieve with this? What do we want? What we want is, we want a program that someone could make a living doing. So another thing that some states have said is, well, there's a huge need for people to get help in the area of evictions. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. But can you make a living helping people who are getting evicted? Not so much. People who are getting evicted are getting evicted because they can't pay their rent. So the chances that they're going to be able to pay someone to help them with that problem, not very high. So we said, even though that's a problem we have to solve, and we need to think about how to address that, and whether we need to think about how to address that. But the other huge area where there's a deep need for legal assistance, you saw it on the screen already, domestic relations. 74% of people going through a divorce are unrepresented. Yep. Yep.
Justice Hart, what exactly is an LLP? I mean, I hear
Well, so we said, what if we could find someone who's not a lawyer, who hasn't gone through all of law school, but who's well-trained in this area of domestic relations, like a nurse is to a doctor. Nurses can provide medical care without having a doctor there. All of us know that you can go to a nurse to get all kinds of assistance. Not
Even
every
a prescription these days. I mean, you can get a prescription.
not everything a doctor can do. There are some things you can't go to a nurse for. You have to go to a doctor. But there are lots of things you can go to a nurse for. And he can help you with a lot of those things. So are there things that a paraprofessional could help you with in a family law case? Are there types of family law cases that you could get help from someone who's not a lawyer, but is a trained paraprofessional? And the answer is yes. There are lots of things that it's hard to do yourself because the language of law is complex and getting through it is overwhelming, and you're in a pretty traumatic space when you're ending or changing a family relationship, but you don't necessarily need a lawyer. So starting from that premise, we said, all right, what is the minimum education we would need? Is there a population of people who is out there already who might like to become licensed and be able to make a little bit more money, maybe practice on their own? Of course there is. There are people who have been long-time paralegals practicing in the family law area here in Colorado already. And as it turned out, our first class of LLPs, 67 people licensed in this June. All of them are people who have been practicing paralegals for a long time. They're experts in family law. This is what they want to do. They want to help people. Some of them are going to continue practicing with the lawyers they had already been practicing with, but they can do more things independently than they could before because they're licensed and they've passed an ethics test and they've passed a substantive, I think for the people who've been practicing, we waived the substantive family law test because they know what they're doing. But they had to take the ethics test and they had to take the ethics course, and they had to pass the licensing exam. The next test is going to be coming up in November, and we've got a similar number of people signed up to take that. So we've got big cohorts of people, bigger than any state has had, who are signing up to do this. And what they want to do is they want to go out and they want to help people who are not necessarily going to be helped by Colorado legal services. They may not be at 200% or lower than the poverty line, but think of all the people who are between that and able to afford a lawyer. All those people who are at what we call above the line, but still can't afford a lawyer, which is most people.
And within that 67, did we have folks from outside the metro area?
Tons. So we had 17 people in Colorado Springs. We had, I don't know the exact numbers in Pueblo, but we had quite a number in Pueblo. We had people from the Western Slope. We had people from all over the state. So this is really looking, we're looking at this as a statewide opportunity. And we'll get a couple of years of this under our belt, but we've already had people reaching out and saying, can we expand this to other areas? Is this only ever going to be family law? Or in communities where we have no lawyers, can we start looking at whether this is possible in other areas?
And Melissa, since we're talking about access and barriers, how expensive is it for an LLP to get certified? Do you have any sense, was there much of a cost? Or is it fairly low barrier?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. What I do know is that Community College of Denver is offering both the ethics class and the the substantive family law class, and they're offering it both as an in-person class
Got it.
and as an online option so that people can take it from outside of the metro area. To be eligible to be an LLP, all you have to have is a bachelor or an associate's degree. If you went to paralegal school, that's a qualifying degree. So again, what we try to do is think, why these barriers? What's the purpose of these barriers? Let's not have barriers for the sake of having barriers. Let's only have what we consider to be minimum qualifications, because that's what we do for lawyers. We only have what we can. We're not trying to, maybe we should be trying to graduate the best lawyers, but that's not what we're doing. We're looking for minimum
Except here at
qualifications.
Colorado law.
What?
Except
Well,
here at
right,
Colorado law.
of course. But for everybody else, we're just looking for the minimum.
So for those of you who want to know more about this, the Colorado Rules of Civil Procedure, Rule 207.1, is the authority that grants the scope of what they can and cannot do. And as Justice Hart said, there are some things that they cannot do, that analogous between the nurse practitioner and the doctor. And they all know, trust me, I have met many and many of them, and they all know what that line is. Like, they know that there are times when they need to consult with an attorney, or they need to refer the case out to an attorney. So it's really clear. The other thing that I learned that I didn't know initially, and I've been part of this process for a couple of years now, was, they have their own rules of professional conduct. So just like attorneys, they have like almost mirrored rules of professional conduct that they also have to adhere to. They have to comply with continuing legal education, just like all of you here in the room. They also have to do all of their ethics and DEI responsibilities. So the same requirements that we have as an attorney are the requirements that they will have as LLPs to keep their license active.
What was nice about the process of getting this done is we had to go to the legislature and ask to have a number of statutes amended so that where it says an attorney can do X or Y, it says an attorney or licensed legal paraprofessional. So we were able to educate the legislature about, first of all, about the shortage of lawyers in many of these cases, and sort of bring them on board and teach them about some of the challenges that Coloradans face when they have legal needs. And it was a very collaborative process, and lots of people, not only lawyers, but paralegals and folks at Community College of Denver, and it was just a huge collaborative effort to make this happen.
You've already addressed this.
Yeah?
But I've actually had a couple of licensed ones already through NVL. Mm-hmm. What is their scope? Can they handle a fully contested hearing?
So one of the things that here in Colorado, and again, different states are doing things differently, but here in Colorado, a licensed legal paraprofessional can accompany a client to court. They cannot present evidence. They cannot cross-examine a witness. If a judge asks them a question, they can answer the question. So we're also doing training with our judges about how to interact with an LLP in court. Some judges, I don't know any judge who's hostile to the idea. Some judges are just sort of like, how is this gonna work? And some judges are really excited and have already said, I'm gonna be asking them questions. I'm going to be engaging with them and asking them to help me sort out what's happening in a case.
So from what you described, you can handle an uncontested hearing, because that would still require them to ask questions of the client.
Have you handled a domestic relations case? Okay, I think there are a lot of domestic relations cases they'll be able to handle that. Yeah.
With an uncontested, you still have to present evidence to the judge in way of testimony.
Correct. So you have to still do the standards with respect. Some of our judges, though, and thank you for volunteering with MVL, but some of our judges will lead the conversation. But at this point in time, we do have LLPs volunteering with MVL, which is fantastic. They are doing our consultation. A lot of the paralegals have 20, 30 years experience that are now LLPs. They know more than some of our attorneys do. So.
of what they can do in the courtroom. Because it sounds like if it's just, here's what's going to happen to you, that's a nice little start, but it really doesn't help the unrepresented person because they don't know what to do or say when they get up into the witness box.
I was saying that if they can't handle questions, putting their clients up on the witness stand, it sounds like we're tying their hands because particularly with a non-contested hearing, you don't need to really know the rules of evidence, right? But I'm not quite sure the parameters of what they can do in a hearing setting. I've worked with them. I also do the power of attorney clinic with MVL, and I've worked with them there as well.
And I agree with you. I think that there are limitations within the courtroom. But I think outside of the courtroom, there's just so much fantastic work that they can do. You know, as far as drafting documents, parenting plans, separation agreements, they can consult, they can sit in the courtroom next to a victim of domestic violence, for instance, and really help empower them and lead them with what's going on. But there are limitations to what they can't do. For instance, you know, I think you asked about, you know, well, can they do like an analysis of the law because they haven't been to law school, and they can't. So one of their restrictions is that they're not allowed to deal with a non-parent party looking for custody, parenting time of a child. They can't have an argument with respect to the definition of common law. Yeah. So absolutely.
Complicated cases.
Yeah, so complicated cases they can't do.
But there's refer out.
So much that they can. I mean, you know, I can tell you, and if you have volunteered with MVL, you know, when a pro se party comes into the courthouse dealing with anything at all, they are overwhelmed with the paperwork, with the forms, and just sitting down with them and being able to guide them through that process. And the court's done a fantastic job of doing JDF forms, but even those are just so frightening to a lot of these parties.
And I'll just say before I know there's another question in the back, but what your questions highlight, I think really well, is that there's a lot of work that still could be done with licensed legal paraprofessionals, and this is a first step. And I would say that in the area of appearing in court, that's the area where the court was the most cautious because we wanted to get a rule in place. We wanted to roll this out, and we wanted to see how it worked. And once we have it in place for a couple of years, see how it's working, I'm confident that people will come back to us and say, all right, we're ready to expand it or adjust it. And that's one of the good things about doing something like this by rule that can be changed because it has to evolve. I think that will be important. And we passed it knowing that that would happen.
And Justice Hart, I think we all, in our drive to make sure that we're doing this, we're also protecting the client,
right,
also protecting the consumer. So as much as we want to make sure there is access to justice, there has to be that balance that they're actually getting, you know, good legal advice in an appropriate manner. So.
Yep, exactly, yes.
Is there another question?
I'm just curious, what's the hourly rate that somebody typically charges that's in LLP, or do they do a flat rate for something?
Well, it just started in June, and when was the ceremony?
The ceremony was June 20th, and actually I don't think they could start practicing until July 1st because that's when the statutory changes went into effect.
I think that's right. So I think that's still, it'll be market-based, and we'll see how that develops.
Yeah. And, you know, we can't set what they can charge, just like we can't set what attorneys can charge. I think the market will demand what they do. Right now, any LLPs that I've spoken to are billing at a lower hourly rate, or the firms that they're working with are billing at a lower hourly rate than their junior attorneys, but more than their paralegals, somewhere in that between space.
Yeah.
And that'll be one of the things that will, I mean, one of the big questions, I would say, is this actually an access to justice solution? If it turns out that they start charging fees comparable to what the market lets attorneys charge, it will have been a real disappointment. Yeah. But the premise of doing this is that won't happen.
And Justice Hart, I can say to you that the ones that volunteer with MVL, we have a huge volume of LLPs volunteering with us, percentage-wise, compared to the attorneys that volunteer with us. So they are all access to justice driven.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. We have another question.
So I'm thumbing my way through Rule 207, which doesn't come up well on the phone, but to what extent will this make incursions enable LLPs to practice in administrative courts? And will 207.1 have to change as the Supreme Court decides new areas of competence where the LLPs can practice?
Mm-hmm.
So nothing in 207 would allow LLPs to practice in administrative courts, but many of our administrative courts and the federal administrative courts already allow non-attorneys to represent people. So I think one of the assumptions that is false, that a lot of resistance to reform has come from, is the idea that you have to be an attorney to represent someone, period. And it turns out that when you start looking around, there are lots of areas where you don't have to be an attorney to represent someone. And administrative processes is one of the huge areas where, for a long time, people have been able to be represented by non-attorneys.
VA.
So it could be that LLPs will represent people in administrative processes, but it won't be because of Rule 207. It will be because that's just been permitted.
For farmers, veterans,
Yeah.
there's a number of groups that they allow that. Another great example is the federal government's actually been doing this since 1958.
Yeah.
And one of the areas in which we've seen huge popularity grow in Colorado is with federally accredited representatives that work in the area of immigration. And we have about 19 of those, soon to be 20, in Colorado. And I looked at the list on Friday, they really are spread throughout the state. They are non-attorneys. They do have to demonstrate to the Department of Justice that they have education, training, experience in basic immigration matters. Many of them have worked as paralegals for an immigration nonprofit or a law firm. They are allowed to do certain limited immigration services. They can help complete naturalization paperwork. They can help with Victims Against Women Act petitions. They can help folks with DACA and DACA renewals. There's a whole host of immigration law functions. They are permitted, if they get a certain type of certification, to represent clients in immigration proceedings before Department of Homeland Security. And it really was a program designed to increase immigration representation to low-income immigrants. It's, once again, a population that cannot afford attorneys. And many times they need the immigration credentials to sustain themselves and to earn a living and to be successful here so that they can hire lawyers at some point. But the interesting part of this project, or this program, which is a little bit different than the way you all structured the LLP program, is they have to work for a recognized nonprofit or legal service provider. And those providers are organizations that are helping low-income immigrants. And the number of these have grown in Colorado, at least in the last 10 years. A couple of examples. One of them is the San Luis Valley Immigrant Resource Center. That's one that the Lawyers Committee has worked with for 25 years now. Many of you are familiar with the San Luis Valley. Some of you may not be. It's the size of Connecticut. And it comprises about 6 counties. 2 of them, unfortunately, are some of the poorest in the state of Colorado and among the poorest in the nation. Many of the folks there are below the poverty level, and they don't have many immigration attorneys, and yet there is a very high immigrant community down there. Many of them are working in the agricultural sector. Many of them are seasonal or migrant workers. But about 50% of the valley's population is originally from Mexico or Guatemala, or some of the Central American countries. San Luis Valley Immigrant Resource Center has a legal program that they've had for over 20 years. And there is, Flora Archuleta runs it, and it's a non-attorneys, and they are on a daily basis helping provide legal service. And they do that either for free, pro bono, or low bono. They do have some of the work that they do that have very low kind of cost. Nothing's more than $100 or $200 as a flat fee for some of the work that they do. But we are also, the Lawyers Committee right now, just partnered with the Hispanic Affairs Project, and they are covering 6 central western Colorado counties for this same type of work. And they had lost their paralegal that was doing this work years ago. They lost their accreditation and will be submitting their application before the month ends to get recertified and provide legal services there. So there are a lot of great benefits to these programs. I think that the LLP program here is also going to be a really interesting experiment to see where these things go and whether it can and should be expanded. Will be interesting to see.
And I would just add, connecting it back to, again, we can't pro bono our way out of these problems. What's important about all of this is, again, one of the pieces of pushback, areas of pushback to it is the fear that some attorneys have that this is taking clients away from attorneys. But these are all people who just aren't being represented by attorneys. And haven't been and wouldn't be.
The market's already spoken in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Like you've already shown that attorneys can't afford to practice in these areas.
Yeah. So these are all people who just aren't being reached by attorneys, and in many instances aren't eligible for pro bono service through organized programs, and therefore, again, it's trying to find other ways to help people who desperately need help. And it's something that as attorneys, I believe that we have an obligation to be thinking about how to help these folks, how to help the legal system help them. We may not be able to do it ourselves, but we can think about creative ways to help the legal system work for these communities. And that's, I think, part of why Colorado Lawyers Committee is doing it. It's part of why the court is very focused on coming up with innovative ways to address it. We certainly consider it, all 7 of us consider it our obligation as leaders of the justice system in Colorado to make the system work for all Coloradans wherever we can. So that's why we're focused on it.
It's interesting how different the challenge is. Like in the metro area, it's not for a lack of lawyers, right? It's the affordability issue. Mm-hmm. But you go to some of these communities, it really is about the pipeline of lawyers who want to live and practice in rural areas, and whether they can make a living doing it, whether they want to live there. And so I think that the state and the Access to Justice Commission are doing some really interesting things to try to increase that pipeline of lawyers. They have a great internship program now where they get law students who come in and practice in some of these rural communities with the hope that they'll decide to stay. Yeah. And that seems to have had some good success.
Justice Hart, I have a question for you. What is being done to support the judges in these areas that are having a lot of pro bono cases? Because it's a lot harder to be a judge where your client, the parties before you are pro bono. You're left to doing your own research, for example.
You mean pro se?
Pro se, yes, I'm sorry.
No worries. Well, first of all, there is no part of Colorado where a lot of your cases aren't pro se. I mean, this is true in Denver District Court, and it's true in Uray County, and it's true everywhere. There's not a Uray County. Sorry, we're doing everything that we can. We've got self-represented litigant coordinators in every district. The self-represented litigant coordinators are professionals who are in each county to work with self-represented litigants. That's what we call them. As John Asher always used to point out, they're really unrepresented litigants, but it sounds nicer when you say self-represented. Who are there to help them understand the process, help to some extent fill out forms. We also have professionals in the court system called family court facilitators who in domestic relations cases are there, they triage the cases before they get to the judges. So again, in domestic relations cases, so many of them have unrepresented parties on both sides. So the family court facilitators will work with the two parties to try to help understand what it is that they want, and so that the court's not having to try to do that. Still, by the time it gets to the judge is having to figure that out. And it's hard. And when you talk to judges, the judge that Toni-Anne was mentioning, who had only 2 lawyers in a series of cases where she should have had 28 if things were functioning the way they should have, you know, what are we doing? We try to manage caseloads in a way that recognizes that cases with unrepresented litigants can be harder, although frankly in domestic relations, cases with lawyers can be equally hard, just in a different way. We try to provide mental health resources because that's part of the problem. We provide training on what are sort of your ethical boundaries in working with unrepresented litigants. How much help can you provide them in understanding the system? Obviously, you can't be their advocate. We have an ethical obligation to be neutral, but how much can you do to explain the process and help them understand? For example, when they're trying to present evidence and they don't understand the rules of evidence, you can't authenticate a document for them, but can you explain what it means to authenticate a document? What is it that they need to prove to you? And I think pretty universally around the country, in every state, people understand the canons of judicial conduct or the rules of ethics to permit you to do that you can provide some amount of explanation. You can't do it for them, but you can explain what you're looking for. And so we train judges on that so that they have some idea of how to do this, but you're right, it's just harder. It's really hard. And we also do try to let new judges know going in, you're not going to be dealing with lawyers a lot of the time. A lot of your cases are not going to involve lawyers because particularly for new judges who are coming from practices that have lawyers, like for example, new judges who are coming in from being DAs or PDs where there are lawyers on both sides in most of their cases, they're really surprised to learn how much of the practice does not involve lawyers on both sides. And it's hard.
I'm going to pick back up on just what we're doing to address some of the rural legal deserts that exist in Colorado. Earlier this year, one of our great access to justice heroes, Rick Morgan, passed away. Rick was an attorney in Elbert County. He founded the virtual pro se clinic about 11 years ago. It's an amazing program. Melissa, let's talk a little bit about what was so innovative about that program and what we're trying to do now to make sure it continues.
Has anyone who's in the room now, did anyone here ever volunteer for the virtual pro se clinic? No? Oh, Marco, you did?
Some of the probate. And then it started in Elbert and some of the others, so.
Great.
Yep.
So the virtual pro se clinic, again, this amazing man started them, and he partnered with libraries around the state, and it started in just a few libraries, but ultimately, as the slide says, was it 87 different public, was it at 80?
Yeah, 87 public libraries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Around in really almost 46 out of the 64 counties in the state. And the public libraries and the public libraries would find space, and of course, and this comes to the digital divide question, access to the internet in their libraries, where people in their communities could come in and sign up for a time to talk to Rick or one of the folks who volunteered for him. I volunteered for him before I was appointed to the court. And I think the first year that I volunteered, it was either 2013 or 2014, and I had never heard of Zoom before. And I actually thought that he invented Zoom because, again, I had never heard of it.
Really was a pioneer.
He said we do this over Zoom, and I was like, okay. But I didn't have to have a Zoom account. He just sent me this link. So again, I just thought, okay, this is something that Rick has done where I just click on this link and I'm suddenly in the library in Elbert County or in Yuma County. And you're talking to a person, you know, I was sitting in my house or it was when I was teaching here, so I would sit in my office here at the law school and talk to a person in the library in a different county, and they would, I mean, it's just like working at a legal clinic here in Denver, and they tell you what their problem is, and then he created, and we're going to be changing it, but he created something called the checkerboard, which is this, looks like a checkerboard, and it has, you can share your screen, because you can do that on Zoom, which of course now I know, but at the time I was just like, oh, this is so cool. He created this thing where you can share your screen. Isn't that neat? So I could share my screen and the person on the other screen could look at, you know, let's say there were a number of trust and estate type problems. That was actually quite common, which is not an area of law I ever practiced. So one of the things that people often say when they are explaining why they can't do any pro bono work is, I don't know that field, that's not my field. And the answer is, yes, you can. It doesn't matter. You know more than the person asking you questions. You may not be able to take a case and handle it from beginning to end, but you know legal language and you know how to at least answer the question of, here's the statute that you want to look at. Here's some of the questions you're going to want to ask. This is something you probably are going to need to hire a lawyer for. You know, like, or this is something that you might be able to do alone. There's something called a Sherlock at the courthouse. Like, even that, a lot of people don't know. So you can help someone even if it's not an area of law that you know. And I knew that already from doing clinics through Metro Volunteer Lawyers, but the Pro Se Clinic was an incredible education for me about that, because I, again, had never talked to someone about how to divide their family farm. But the checkerboard would show up and you could, you know, click on trusts and estates, and it opened up a bunch of other categories, and then you could click on the statute, and you could click on, it was amazing.
The problem was so much of the back side of the operation of that project was
one person
in Rick's head,
yes,
or written down on 1,000 pieces of papers and Post-its.
Yes.
So unfortunately, you know, Rick had come to the Lawyers Committee earlier last fall and wanted to hand this off to us, and we had planned on transitioning the project to the Lawyers Committee effective 2025. And then suddenly Rick passed.
Very suddenly, unexpectedly, tragically.
The fortuitous piece of this was that the Access to Justice Commission had an existing grant to help rural Colorado, and we were able to hire staff up. We are putting the pieces back together to ensure this project survives. We're in 6 counties now. We'll be in 10 shortly, and we plan on re-engaging with volunteers. So please keep an eye out for that if you're interested in participating after the first of the year. But our goal really is to ensure that this legacy continues, because Rick was helping countless number of folks in areas that normally would not have access to a lawyer, or just to someone a good critical thinker,
yep,
to help them navigate and understand systems and how they work. But the long-term plan, and I want to talk about this a little bit because I do think this is really innovative, and there definitely are some states that have done this, but Colorado is going to be the next, I hope. Through the Access to Justice Commission, the longer-term plan is also to launch a statewide online self-help portal for legal issues. It will really complement the virtual pro se clinic. It'll complement a lot of what the bar does, the amazing programs there, what the lawyers committee does. It will be helping connect people with a legal need to someone who can help them and get them to appropriate legal resources. The goal is to have it as a single platform, and they'll roll it out to certain, again, baby steps, discrete subject matter area, legal areas initially, and expand it over time. They've got the funding through Legal Services Corp, which is amazing to develop this. We are in the R&D stage, I would describe it as. But other states, Utah, Arizona, I don't know, there's some others that have done something very similar, but that's certainly coming next.
And I just want to say that Colorado Legal Services is a huge player in that, because it's important that we are not trying to recreate the wheel or not trying to duplicate and have 20 of these websites out there. We're always looking for sort of one place for people to go to get help, and also one place for attorneys to go to volunteer.
Yeah, it's very much a partnership between those two organizations. Another point I think we ought to say is that, we're sitting here in Boulder, we all office in Denver, but many times the best solutions to local access to justice issues come from local leaders, and they happen in the community. And one of the great things we have here in Colorado are local access to justice committees. Would you mind talking a little bit about that, Melissa?
Not at all. And I realize I go on, and so you have to cut me off. I'll try to stop doing that. Yes.
Usually the other way with judges.
Yes, so we have the local access to justice committees are, as the slide suggests, chaired by someone in each community. We don't have them in every district in the state. Some of the districts just don't have enough lawyers to sustain a local access to justice committee, but some of them are so thriving that they take care of communities near them. So for example, the 10th Judicial District in Pueblo really reaches out and takes care of the southeastern corner of the state and ensures that it's thinking about the needs of the southeastern corner of the state. And the committees include lawyers and the self-represented litigant coordinators and non-lawyers who are committed to working on access to justice in their communities. And they put on legal resource days. Several of them put on really impressive senior days where they help folks with specifically problems related to seniors in their communities. And then they meet by Zoom, which we now know was not created by Rick Morgan, every other month to share ideas and talk about what things might work in different parts of the state. And it's been really great to watch how they partner across jurisdictions, and some really great ideas have come out of them. And I think it's interesting that one of the things we've learned, both Emo, the executive director of the Access to Justice Commission, and I, as the chair of the Local Access to Justice Subcommittee of the Commission, so I set up these every other month phone calls. We've learned in talking to our the folks in other states, Colorado is one of the only states that has these local access to justice committees. And so we've had a lot of folks from other states reach out to us and ask to attend those every other month meetings and kind of see how it works, and talk to us about setting up local access to justice committees in their states. And I find it so surprising because it seems to me like such an obvious thing to do. Things should not be done top-down statewide. Local solutions are necessary, and local conversations are necessary.
Can any lawyer get involved in their local Access to Justice Committee?
Absolutely. And on the Access to Justice Commission website, we have the contact information for all of the local committees. So
encourage folks to do that.
Yeah, it's an easy thing to do, and they're always looking for new volunteers.
I do think that point about other states not doing it is interesting to me too. I mean, I spoke with actually Judge Taubman at an Equal Justice conference a couple of years ago because no one really was doing it or understood why we were doing it. And I participate in these. Actually, the Denver Bar hosts one of our local access to justice committees, and it is really great just to hear the different ideas. I mean, it is truly a sharing opportunity to see how people are trying to do things in different ways. So, because we all have different problems according to where we live and work.
Yep, exactly. Well, let's talk about another, I think, innovation for Colorado. This is new for us, and this is the recently passed legislation. It is the Equal Justice Fund. We've created a new governmental authority in Colorado. It is a fund that is the resources and the money from court filing fees come into this fund. The expectation and hope is that they will generate about $5 million in annual funding. It obviously depends on the filings each year, but it's going to provide some pretty incredible resources to fund legal aid. 67% of the money collected will go directly to Colorado Legal Services, as long as they remain the state's contracted direct legal service provider, which we expect will continue. And the other 33% will go to qualified direct legal aid providers. It's pretty incredible advancement for us. Legal aid has been really underfunded in our state for many, 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 many years. And this is going to provide a steady stream of new revenue, which hopefully will really help us close this access to justice gap. And it was a wonderful coalition of organizations that came together around this and got this passed. So the new fees will start, I think, first of the year. And first distributions will go to the organizations next July. So that's pretty exciting.
And I just want to add, too, that, you know, if people are below that 150% of the poverty line, they can get their fees waived. So this was a concern for us when we were looking at this fund, making sure that we're not punishing the people we're then trying to help. So most people will get their fees waived because they fall under that 150% anyway.
And it doesn't apply in small claims court at all. Yeah, right. Let's talk a little bit about the Federal Pro Se Clinic. This opened its doors in 2018, and it's operated by the Bar Association. Toni-Anne, you want to talk a little bit about some of the really exciting projects that are going on there?
And actually, we had conversation in 2018, but didn't open our doors until 2020.
Okay.
So just for clarification, most of the time, and so this is a unique, again, Colorado, I find often is on the forefront of access to justice issues. And here's another example. The federal court was aware that people just don't understand how to work within the federal court. So they came to the Colorado Bar and said, we'd love to have a self-help organization in, the clinic in our courthouse, but we can't cross that line of the court giving advice to people that then would be before us. So the Colorado Bar hires, we have a full-time managing attorney and a full-time paralegal, and then we also have a bankruptcy attorney as well, because once it caught on, the bankruptcy court jumped on board with us as well. So the federal court 100% funds this. It's fantastic, but the bar employs and regulates the staff that run it. We're in the courthouse answering questions that people come to us. A lot of the questions come from the judges. They'll say, go downstairs and have that answered for you. So I just pulled up some of the numbers. First of all, most of the cases are employment and civil rights. We do limited scope, and we're also using volunteers like you, so that you can come and volunteer with us. So we use volunteers in the community to give them like a half-an-hour consultation, and then we also partner with a full federal panel that does more in-depth cases as well. So from January to June of this year, 118 appointments were completed, and in the bankruptcy court, 93 were completed. So it's really exciting. We had a 4-year contract from 2020 to 2024, and we just renewed it this year, so we're in for another 4 years. We're really excited to partner with the court in this really unique way. We're one of only, I think, 3 states that have this relationship.
I think it's really rebuilding, too, because there was sort of a period of lapse just with some staff turnover, and it's really wonderful to see how much momentum they have going right now.
Yes, and thank you, Kristin. She sits on our board, our advisory board, with respect to the Federal Pro Se Clinic.
Talk about Kristin Mix's project, though. The Pro Se Prisoner Pilot Program is really exciting.
It is really exciting because really there's not a lot of place for prisoner rights in our state. Not a lot of people will take those cases unless they are impact litigation like Colorado Legal Lawyers Committee. So Judge Kristin Mix retired, came to us and said, I want to develop this prisoner pro se party clinic. And so we are experimenting in Teller County with one jail where prisoners can send questions in by mail, not email, because they're not allowed to have email. And then we set up an appointment with them with an attorney to talk about those cases. It's really in its infancy stages, but we're hoping that we'll get some real traction and maybe expand to other prisons as well.
I'll tell you, I love to live in a state that takes access to justice seriously, and it's not just lip service. And I think, you look at the collective or shared value that we all have, both from the courts and the private bar, the nonprofit community, in recognizing the importance of closing this gap for public health, our economy, the strength of our democratic institutions. And I think one of the things that really resonated with me in showing this was the listening tour. And I'll tell you, our U.S. Supreme Court justices, it seems like every one of them has a book deal right now. It doesn't matter your persuasion. It could be Alito, Sotomayor, they all have their memoirs. So they're doing book tours. But I love that here in Colorado, you have one of our justices doing a listening tour, trying to connect with marginalized communities.
I get no money for it. Before we talk about the listening tour, though, a program that and I can't believe I did this, but I forgot to include in our conversation, but then walking in today, I was reminded by a 2004 CU grad who's in this year's cohort of Legal Entrepreneurs for Justice, which shorthand is LEJ. Legal Entrepreneurs for Justice is Colorado's affordable law practice incubator. We started it in 2018, maybe 19. I was one of the founding board members for it. Toni-Anne was also a founding board member, right?
Yes.
But we discovered that it's really, really hard to get people to give money to a nonprofit for lawyers. So we were very lucky. What?
Tell me about it.
Yeah, exactly. We were very lucky that the Colorado Attorney Mentor Project, CAMP for short, was willing to take it on. CAMP is part of the Office of Attorney Regulation Council, or is sort of adjacent to the Office of Attorney Regulation Council. And so the overhead for Legal Entrepreneurs for Justice is handled there. And what this program does is for attorneys who want to start their own affordable law practice, so serving clients, and again, this is the people in the middle, it's the above the line folks, serving people in the middle, running affordable law practices. The incubator helps attorneys learn how to do that, because you don't so much learn that in law school. You don't really learn how to run a law practice in law school, or really how to be a lawyer in law school.
Except at Colorado law.
Yeah, I'm not going to get on board with that. So it teaches you things like how to design a website and what are the kinds of software you can use to run a practice. How do you figure out where to find your clients? How do you network with clients? How do you sort of all the things that you need to do to run a business? And instead of doing it by yourself, you're doing it with a cohort of other people who are trying to figure out how to do that too, but it's your firm. And so you decide what you want to practice in. Do you want to start a family practice? Do you want to start an elder law practice? Do you want to start a criminal practice? Do you want to start an environmental practice focused on mediation, or whatever you think you want to do your practice in? That's your choice. But what Legal Entrepreneurs for Justice does is it helps you figure out how to run a business and do that in a supportive environment. So if you want any more information about that, I urge you to go to lej.co. It's just a really exciting thing, and it's a really important piece of solving the access to justice gap here in Colorado, because it's another way to think about addressing that above the line group, which is such an important missing piece. So the listening tour. The first listening tour, as you can see here, was in 2021. It was during the pandemic. We thought in 2020, the Access to Justice Commission was like a lot of us thinking, all right, this pandemic will be over in the fall, and then we're going to start thinking about a big statewide get-together to have the state think about what our next steps should be for access to justice. And then it was fall 2020, and we were like, okay, that doesn't seem like it's going to end soon, and we can't just sort of wait now for what seems like it could be sort of indefinite to have a statewide conversation. So let's rethink what we could do to really examine what's going on in the state in terms of access to justice. And we thought, all right, well, we're not going to do something statewide. Let's instead visit people where they are, but since we can't visit people where they are, let's use Zoom, which we've all gotten pretty good at. And by the time we actually did it, we had gotten very good at it. So we had virtual meetings, and we really focused on not only inviting members of the legal community, but trying to reach out to non-legal partners, because those are the people who can tell us why people aren't coming and using legal solutions to solve their problems. Why we know that there are lots of people who have problems that the courts might be able to help them with, but that are not coming to the courts. Why not? Where are we failing to address problems? So we reached out and talked to people working in schools and hospitals, to community political leaders, to people working with homeless populations, to people working with immigrant communities. We reached out to the local access to justice committees and to the local CLS employees and to the local political leaders and said, who are the people in your community we should be inviting? And put the lists together that way. And Elisa Overall, who I mentioned earlier, the executive director of the Access to Justice Commission, had just started. And she and I worked together with a lot of other volunteers on putting these lists together.
So what were your findings?
So if we go to the next slide,
Yep.
we found, and none of them were surprising, but it was interesting to get some more texture to them. We found that the biggest problems people were dealing with were eviction, divorce, custody, domestic abuse, and getting access to government benefits. That these, both at the state and federal level, these were the problems that people struggled with, that they had the most trouble addressing. And then the prominent barriers were the costs, that laws and procedures are complex, that there were language and cultural barriers that presented really big impediments. Technology was a huge problem. And we witnessed it during the tour. Like a lot of the conversations that we had in more rural communities, people had to keep their screens off because there was not enough bandwidth for them to engage in the conversation with their screens on. If they wanted to be able to have the conversation, they had to have their screens off. And the calls would drop, and they would sign back in and drop and sign back in. Or they would have to go to a library or somewhere like that if they could. Again, it was during COVID. And then transportation. A lot of people during the pandemic said, oh, technology is going to be the solution to our problems because now we can do virtual court and people won't have to travel to the courthouse. Well, one of the things that came up again and again is, again, San Luis Valley is a great example. If you live in the San Luis Valley, you have no access to technology, and there are no public buses. And many, many people live 40 or 50 or 60 miles from the nearest courthouse. So you have no access to a courthouse either through transportation or through technology. That's not a problem that the courts can solve, but it's a problem that the courts need to be part of addressing because it means we're not providing the access to justice that we need to be providing. So although we can't solve the problem, we can't ignore it either. We have to be talking to the right partners to be sure that it gets addressed.
So let's talk a little bit about what we can do. I want to talk about pro bono work. I agree with Melissa, and I think Dave Stark said this too. We're not going to volunteer our way out of the problem, but we all have a professional responsibility to do pro bono. I want to talk a little bit about that rule and what all of us are expected to do and should be doing and are out there doing. And much of that happens through MVL and organizations through the bar. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. So this is, where we're going to weave in your ethics, but also give you a little bit of, social conscience. I'm going to start with a preamble, right? We all took an oath to serve our community. And I just want to remind you all to take the time to read your oath, to know. I'm fortunate I am present at all of our swearing-in ceremonies, mainly because I'm trying to really make sure people know that pro bono is out there and that we have this need. But I get to do this twice a year. I stand up and take my oath every year, and it's wonderful. It's a great reminder that we have this responsibility. And I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to squeeze in all DEI stuff here. I want to talk a little bit about our population. So I'm just going to give you a couple statistics, and then we'll move on. So you may or may not know, 86% of our population is white. Of those, 8.1% are in poverty. 22% of our population is Latino. 13% of those are in poverty. Black African American, 4.7% of our population. And here it's nearly triple, more than 4 times, 17.8% are in poverty. Our Asian population, 3.8%, 9% in poverty. And this one really hurts me. And by the way, we have the Denver Indian Clinic at MVL, so you can volunteer. The Native American population, 1.7% is our population of Native Americans in Colorado. 27.9% of them are in poverty. So, and we're going to move to, this is not doom and gloom, this is how we solve the problem. We help, it's part of the puzzle, as we start giving back. So under Colorado Rule 6.1, please volunteer. It's an aspirational goal of 50 hours. Do it. It's so easy to do with so many programs out there, and we can talk about what those programs are. We'll do a quick, fast run through them at the end.
It's 50 on average, right, through your course of your career. So
50 a year.
You may, on average.
On average.
So you may have a year where you do 100 hours, and another year where maybe you're doing 20. But
absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And as an added bonus, and I think it's that next slide, you can actually get CLE credit for doing pro bono work as well through an organization that does pro bono. So yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt right in the middle of this, but I've been listening to you. First of all, thank you to the three of you for the work that you're doing. As I'm listening to the statistics and the access to justice, there seems to be a segment that is not being identified or talked about a lot. So I'm an elder law attorney. I'm also public administrator for the 18th Judicial District. And the elder issues, guardianship, conservatorship, incapacity issues, death, dying, disability, these are in the probate arena mostly. Mm-hmm. And so even starting with your first slide, I always, I don't see the attention given to that. I don't know if that's inside the civil numbers or not, but I can tell you on a daily basis in our firm, we get dozens of calls, and I'm not exaggerating, a week for these kinds of cases and needs, access to justice. Some of them are above the line, a lot of them are below. Mm-hmm. And we do our pro bono work, we do our court appointment work, my public administrator work. But I'm curious in your listening tour, in what you're seeing, the elder issues, the aging issues in our communities, rural, urban. I'm not hearing that piece. Maybe it's baked into everything, but I hear domestic relations and immigration. But obviously being an advocate in the elder law arena, I just am not hearing that segment that, at least from my perspective, is a great need in access to justice.
And I'd love to address that. So at Metro Volunteer Lawyers, we actually have an estate planning program.
Yeah, and I've participated over the years, and I'm familiar.
Right. So not only do we have a full referral program where we can help individuals who qualify to get wills or probate matters taken care of, but we go into senior centers in the Denver metro area as much as twice a week and help elder seniors complete their end-of-life documents. We now actually help them do end-of-life will as well as their living will using computer software. So I understand what you're saying, and we actually recently got a grant from COLTAF to help subsidize our estate planning program. So we're going to hopefully have more money funneling into that so that we can use technology such as software to really increase our ability to help those in that community.
Sure.
Absolutely. And we do those as well, not in the planning program, but we'll do conservatorship and guardianships and, within our full referral program.
And it's a population that, is vulnerable to fraud, just like the immigrant communities and notarios that can be fraudulent. So it is an area that we absolutely should be spotlighting more. Thanks, Marco.
And I'll note, Marco, I think that's actually really important, and I could imagine that being, I'm not saying it's come up yet, but I could imagine that being an area that we could explore next, say, for LLPs. I think it's because we do have a rapidly aging population and the need is only going to grow. So I think that's really important.
I'm going to do fast forward.
Oh, okay. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was there is a continuum of legal services. Obviously, you can volunteer at a clinic and help someone in a very limited way. You could provide simply legal information or legal resources and not even provide legal advice. You can work at a legal clinic. There are loads of those. Including Denver Legal Night, which is not in there. I should have added that. You can help with ADR. You can do limited scope representation. We recommend you do limited scope agreements with your client when you do those, or you could have full representation. Let's skip over this because what I want to talk about is the biggest reason that I find lawyers don't get nervous. There's like anxiety around doing pro bono. And it's because lawyers are so used to being, at least in their minds, the smartest people in the room. They get anxious when there's even the suggestion that they get into a setting where maybe they get asked a question that they don't know, they don't anticipate, and don't necessarily know the answer to. So Toni-Anne, you work with a ton of volunteers too. I'm sure you hear the same thing.
All the time. I think that the biggest, response I get when I say, please come volunteer with us, I get two responses. I don't have the time and I don't have the competence. And really, we can overcome both of those things because you all know that if something happened in your life that needed you to stop dead in your tracks, good or bad, you would do it. So I always say you make the time for things that are important to you. And then competence. So yes, we have a legal obligation, ethical obligation to be competent. And it is so easy with so many programs out there, so many services out there for you to get training, for you to get CLEs, for you to shadow with someone, for you to have a mentor. There really is no excuse anymore about this competence piece. And then 6.5, I just want to go over that. I'm aware of our time. The courts graciously developed this, and Justice Hart had a lot to do with this as well, this rule 6.5 with respect to in clinics. A lot of people are concerned about conflicts. Did I create an attorney-client relationship? This rule allows you in a clinic setting to not have to worry about conflicts with respect to the person that you're serving, with the notion that you're not going to be helping them beyond the scope of that clinic. And then, again, conflicts. You can go through these and read them. Pro bono counsel certification, we wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so. we both have this a lot. Inactive attorneys that just moved here from out of state, older attorneys maybe who are retired. You can continue to engage in pro bono even when you've stopped practicing law actively. And you can do that through this rule, Rule of Civil Procedure 204.6. You apply for this with the Office of Attorney Regulation, and it is a special certification. It is easy, very low fee. You can also ask for the fee to be waived. But the great thing is you can identify an organization, a nonprofit like the Colorado Lawyers Committee, like Metro Volunteer Lawyers, that you then do your pro bono through. So we really highly recommend that.
And so on this volunteer today, I'm going to have to do a quick shout out. So please, if you're looking to help in any capacity, there is a place for you, whether it's in a legal clinic, whether it's in a senior center, whether it is a full representation. I talked a lot about MVL today because that was where we kind of dealt with a lot of the family law issues. And 75% of issues, not only in the courts, but in all of our pro bono work, tends to be domestic. But I want to talk a little bit about what the CBA does as well. So not only does the CBA oversee the federal pro se clinic and bankruptcy clinic, but they also have an appellate clinic for people appealing to the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. So if you're looking to get some expertise there, come join us. We have a cannabis social equity clinic. We have a legal fee arbitration program. And we have, what am I forgetting? I think that might be it.
I'll tell you a little bit about the Colorado Lawyers Committee. We are differentiated from other pro bono organizations because we are a collective impact model. The legal community created the Lawyers Committee back in 1978. And so for the last 46 years, we have worked on big systemic issues. The concept is if it's a big problem that is maybe too big for one law firm's pro bono program or one lawyer to handle on their own, we work on it together. So we'll typically have anywhere from 2 or 3 law firms to, at some cases, we've had 16 law firms involved in a case together. Many times it's impact litigation, but a lot of times it's short of that, negotiation, advocacy, and we would love to have you participate. We have some of the gap filler programs as well, where we see an emerging issue and that we need to really galvanize the legal community to help a particular community at a particular moment in time. That is something the Lawyers Committee does. We'd love for you to help us. We work on immigration, poverty and public benefits, children's rights and education, civil rights and criminal law. And we do it, we have done it for 46 years, and we have probably close to 200 law firms that participate in projects with us. So there is a place for you at the Lawyers Committee.
And I did remember Veterans Clinic. We also have a Veterans Clinic in Colorado Springs and in Denver, if you would like to help veterans as well.
Thanks, folks. We're right at our time, so really appreciate you participating today.
And thank you so much. Hi, I'm Robert Garlick, the Assistant Dean for Advancement at the University of Colorado School of Law. I promise I'm not going to ask you for money. Well, I might ask you for money. But I want to thank our amazing speakers and committed speakers. Thank you so much for what you do, and thank you for being here today. Thank you for being here in the room, and thank you for those who participated online. Please attend our barbecue outside. If you're going to the football game, please enjoy it. And again, thank you for coming to the CLE at Colorado Law and supporting us. We appreciate you all.